Hello everybody in YouTube land. This is Brian. Hello. Anyway, enough of my stupid accent. That right there, not right here, this right here is the Marshall MA100 watt amplifier. And first, I'm going to play just a little bit of kind of like how I like to set it up, just so you can hear just for a second, and what I do as far as how I usually play. Sounds kind of like this. Anyway, so Marshall MA100. Okay, so I have owned a lot of Marshalls, a lot of them. Kind of going through a little bit of the list. First Marshall I got in the early 80s was the Reverb 75 combo, which was a solid state combo. Didn't like it. It was recommended to me because it was supposed to be pretty loud and compact, but just didn't dig it. So traded that one in, and then I got a MA100 single channel 50 watt head with a 412 cabinet, and that's kind of like the quintessential hard rock heavy metal amp of the 80s. Didn't have an effects loop. I just plugged, pedals straight into it. Really, really amazing amp. And then later, I had the MA100 50 watt head, and what else? The Valve State VS100, and a few other Marshalls in between there. And I've also played either on recordings or in music stores or through other people's amps, like most of the Marshalls that they've ever made. I've tried Plexis, I've tried the Super Lead, I've played modified Marshalls, I've played the JCM 2000 series, I owned also the DSL. So anyways, I have had a lot of Marshalls, and one thing I've learned personally about Marshall amps is that even within the same model range, there are variances in tone. I'm not the only one to say that. Even a lot of famous players out there that play Marshalls say, oh yeah, this particular Marshall sounded amazing, better than all the other Marshalls we tried. So because of the variances in circuitries, components, tubes, so on and so forth, because there's a lot of variances that can happen and tolerances with, all the different circuits that go to make these tube amps. They're not all the same, even if they're the same model, so there are some variances. This particular amp, you can still buy brand new the 50 watt version of the head. I've seen them still advertised, but aside from that, they replaced it with a few other amps that they're selling. But a lot of people sort of gave it crap because it was assembled in, I think, China or Vietnam, one of those places. Anyways, even though it was designed by Marshall. And then some people just didn't like the tone. It's like a lot of Marshalls, you have to sort of know what to do with it to get it to do what you want to do. This particular one is probably one of the best sounding Marshalls I've ever played, at least for what I like and what I like in an amplifier. And that says a lot, because this is one of the lowest priced, if not the lowest priced, 100 watt valve amp Marshall produced. And I love it. I absolutely am crazy about this amp, but I know why a lot of people don't care for it, and it's because they don't know how to set it up, and it doesn't get, like, it doesn't sound like a JCM 2000, straight out of the box. It doesn't sound like a DSL 40 or a DSL 100 straight out of the box. There are certain things that are unique to this amp that if you tweak them, if you work with them, it gets an incredible tone, at least this particular one. And I love it. I'll probably never get rid of it. Anyway, one of the things that I learned about this amp is, first off, if you're not using an overdrive pedal to push the front end of it, and it's a very spongy gain structure. Spongy meaning, like, if you take an amp like this, or a dual rectifier, for instance, and you put it on the spongy mode, or in this case, the thick mode, you get a much more sort of smooth attack on the gain, on the distortion. So it's more of a very vintagey kind of distortion. It doesn't really, how can I say, it's not a real fast attack. So for playing metal, it's not really that great for that. It's much better for playing more sort of bluesy rock, and more sort of a classic rock type of tone, where you can, like, back off on the volume of the guitar and really clean it up. It does have, however, more than enough distortion as far as gain is concerned. In fact, with most of the pickups on most of the guitars I have, I can only turn it up. This is the gain on the lead channel. I can only turn it up to about halfway, maybe a little over halfway, somewhere in there, with somewhat hot pickups. Otherwise, the tubes start to get overly saturated, and you start getting that sort of muddy kind of preamp tube distortion. So the sweet spot is like right here in this section, right about here. And some variance depending on how your output of your pickups are. The other thing about this amp is it's a very mid-range strong amplifier. The tone stack on it, even if you turn the mid-range like all the way down, you won't get a real, like, scooped metal sound. It can't take enough mid-range out to get a scooped, like real scooped, dark, sort of that type of tone. So in order to get around that, and one other thing, the bass and the resonance control, especially at lower volumes, you don't get a ton of bass out of the bass control, and you don't get a ton of resonance out of the resonance control, especially at lower volumes. You really got to crank the amp up for those particular, to get that big bottom end sound. So in order to compensate for those types of things, to get the tone that you're hearing now, I use right now I'm using a Boss GT1, which is this thing down here, and I'm using it in the effects loop, and I'm also using a Ibanez tube screamer, okay, for the front end. Okay, so in the effects loop, that's what I'm using. So what I'm doing is, in the effects loop, I've got this thing set up so I have a mid-gain control for the master coming out of here. You can also use like a graphic EQ if you want, or anything that's got an EQ in the effects, going through the effects loop. I'm using the mid-gain cut. So what I'm doing is I'm cutting the mids in the effects loop so that it's emphasizing the lows and the highs. And that's how I'm scooping out the mids to get that kind of tone. The other thing that I do is what a lot of people do that play metal is they use, or hard rock, whatever, is they use a tube screamer and crank the volume up on the tube screamer, keeping the gain either really low or off. Tone control kind of to taste. I use it in the middle. That seems to work good for me. And that just, tightens up the attack. One thing that's really good is the fact that this is a sort of a spongier Marshall, is that it has a lot more fatter sound than a lot of Marshalls I've played. It's not as compressed sounding. Like I had a DSL which was more compressed and sort of mid-focused and really compressed sounding, and I didn't really like that. I think that's one of the things that Joe Satriani did when he had his Marshall design, was that he wanted it to have a little bit more of a spongier attack so that you got a bigger, more dynamic sound. And that's one of the great things about this amp, is it has that. And then you tighten it up to taste by using the tube screamer. So that makes this amp amazing. Okay, so anyway, those are my tricks. Okay, if you own one of these amps, try using a tube screamer on the front end. You don't have to turn the gain up quite as much. I tend to turn the mids either all the way down or most of the way down, bass all the way up, resonance all the way up, presence wherever, somewhere to taste, treble, sort of. Marshall amps are pretty trebly, so you don't really need to crank those up too much. When I turn these things off, I'm going to show you when I have them off what it sounds like, the natural amp, so you can hear the difference. Okay, so first turn off the tube screamer. Second is to bypass the Boss unit. Okay, so now you hear the more sort of spongy attack at the amp hands, and a lot more mid-range in the tone. So you notice it's more of that vintage sort of spongier kind of distortion. And if I crank the gain up, it's still kind of spongy, but it can kind of get overloaded on the gain. So it sounds a lot like a kind of like a dual rectifier, but in that sort of spongy mode, which is it's nice for playing like a blues type of thing, if you're playing blues. Anyway, but that's not the tone that I go for. Okay, so and then also the mid-range, it's very sort of vintagey, mid-rangey Marshall. Crank it up a little bit. And this amp also sounds a lot better when it's cranked a little bit. It's a little buzzier and fuzzier at the lower volumes, and that's I think that's just because the interaction between the power tubes, it just needs some volume to get to sound good. But it's a really It's a nice vintagey sound. It's really wide open, lots of really thick. Anyway, so now if I turn on the tube screamer first, this is still bypassing the boss, so there's no the mid scoop or the other like reverb effect or whatever. Turning on the tube screamer, backing the gain down back to where I normally set it. And now the tone is a lot tighter, a lot tighter. Now we're getting somewhere. Now we're getting like that tone, that hard rock, heavy metal Marshall tone. Now we're getting it. Now, but it's kind of mid-range. It's mid-rangey. There's no reverb obviously on really, but when I turn my Boss unit back on, it turns back on the reverb, turns on my noise gate, and it initiates where I set the mid-range at and the scoop, where I scoop the mids, and this is kind of like where I have it dialed in. Okay, so here we go. So, that's it. That's the that's dialing in this, make this amp sound fantastic to me. This is like one of the holy grails of tones right here. So anyway, if you own one of these amps, try some of this stuff out. You know, try running the tube screamer like I told you to. Try using some EQ through the effects loop, scooping the mids out a bit, and if you have an Ed that works as well as mine, man, you might just love this amp. So there you go. Thanks for watching.